Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for joining our discussion. My name is Eyal Ernov, and I'm a first-year student at the law school. The topic of our discussion today is international law and the media as it pertains to the conflict in Gaza. Upon my return from a recent trip to Israel, I felt compelled to create a forum to discuss the media coverage here and abroad and its potential impact on our understanding of international law, future policymaking, and military strategy. The words war crime, disproportion, and humanitarian crisis have found their way into every form of media during this conflict. Understanding that discussions are often emotionally charged, I became concerned with how journalists cover the conflict one way or another without paying careful attention to using words that have very powerful implications. Last week, I met with Dean Starr about holding an objective panel discussion about the topic, and he supported the idea from the outset. I'm grateful to everyone who helped put this panel together on such short notice, including our three wonderful panelists, one of which is on his way. A big thank you to Dean Starr, Dean Gash, Margaret up in the Dean Suite, Professor Levine, and the students who helped organize this event. Most of all, I appreciate Pepperdine's support for dialogue. This is a perfect illustration to all of us that we should take the initiative to speak to one another, regardless of our ideologies. Progress depends on it. I hope that each of you leaves today with a greater understanding of the issues we will discuss today. It is with great pride, privilege, and honor that I introduce Dean Ken Starr.
Thank you, and thank you for your flexibility. As they say on the airlines, especially on U.S. Airways, thank you for your patience. We've had an unexpected development, which is this wonderful, wonderful gathering of so many of you. Thank you, especially our guests from outside. And would you please join me in saying a special word of welcome to a very distinguished guest and panelist, Rabbi Daniel Bouskila. I told Professor Cossack, our dear friend Roger Cossack, that the introductions are going to be very brief. Now they will be even briefer in light of the expiration of time. But join me in saying to Roger Cossack, we love you on ESPN, we loved you on CNN, but we love you all the more when you're here at Pepperdine University School. What an important topic. Let us not delay in getting to the topic. We're all very deeply, deeply concerned about the conflict, the loss of life, but the issues that underline the loss of life are so terribly important, and we're encouraged by the inauguration of our new president and his soaring rhetoric and his being so active on the job and on day one. The announcement, which was expected, of very distinguished United States Senator, former federal judge, Judge Mitchell and Senator Mitchell, to be a special Middle East envoy. We also give thanks that there have been, at least for the time being, unless, Daniel, you have other news, because he's recently returned from Israel, but there is a unilateral ceasefire on both sides, and so perhaps this is a time when we can be somewhat more sober and reflective on it. This is in the great traditions of Pepperdine University. Last year we were privileged to have with us Alan Dershowitz for a lively conversation. And the next week I shared this with IL, that a member of the class came to me and said, you know, I went to, and I will not name the institution, but you would recognize it. I just want you to know, Alan Dershowitz would not be welcome at the institution I graduated from. Well, we are very hospitable and welcoming, and so we want to welcome especially our distinguished guests from the outside. One of my favorite columnists, and I don't get to read him save for online, I used to, like Roger Cossack loves to say, get my Washington Post in the morning, get my cereal and blueberries, and start reading. But one of my favorite columnists, immensely wise, is Charles Krauthammer. And early this year, in fact, it was his first column of this new 2009 year, he wrote this: some geopolitical conflicts are morally complicated. The Israel-Gaza war is not. You may agree or disagree with that. To further our conversation, I want to first welcome our very distinguished friend, Rabbi Daniel Bouskila, if you would be pleased.
Thank you so much, Dean Starr, and to all the students and guests from the outside. It's a great, great honor, and Eyal, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to see you outside of the synagogue on Shabbat and to be here where you're here on a regular basis. My first question when I was asked to participate in this panel, which I'm thrilled to do so, to discuss the conflict in Gaza. The question that I'd like to raise, and it is a rhetorical question, and I don't mean in any way to diminish the importance of sitting today and having a panel discussion, because it's always important to have an open and frank conversation. But the fact that it's tied to the media coverage, which instinctively we react to, and as a result ask questions, raise issues, based on the images and the reports that appear on the various networks and in the printed media, is why are we having a panel only now? Because the war in Gaza is not 3 weeks old. For the last 6 or 7 years, the residents of the south of Israel, one city in particular, but now it's expanded to many other cities in the south, Sderot, and the entire Gaza region, have been living under constant daily missile attack. Perhaps in the beginning it was reported when there were a few sensationalist reports and we saw the impact of what it has on children, on civilians who do not have a normal life. Just last year I met with 15 teenagers who live in Sderot, whose lives are completely disrupted. In the best case scenario, they can stay home, but they certainly cannot go out into a cafe. And in the worst case scenario, they spend a lot of their time in bomb shelters. Children growing up this way, and kids living their lives on a regular basis. We haven't had panel discussions about it because it's just become routine. It's something that's happened on a regular basis, and the media at a certain point stops covering it, and life moves on. Not only here, but even in Israel, as a matter of fact. The kind of talk on the street in Israel, in Tel Aviv, would be, there was another missile attack on Sderot. Oh, what are you doing tonight? Do you want to go to a movie? Just life moves on, and it just becomes routine. And then, of course, finally when Israel responds, as it did 3 weeks ago and throughout these last 3 weeks, of course, because there is a very strong response on the part of Israel, and the media covers it, and the war is a different genre of warfare than Israel has fought in the past. It's had to gotten used to fighting this kind of war in the last 20 years, because most of Israel's famous wars, if you've studied Israeli history, most of Israel's famous wars have been conventional wars. There is a television show in Israel, much like Saturday Night Live. It's called Eretz Nehederet. What a wonderful place. And it's kind of a combination of Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. It's built into being a news program, and they have people who come as guests, and they imitate politicians. And there was one who came on the news, and he said, you know, I, as a veteran Israeli, really miss the good old days of when we had a normal, straight-up tank versus tank, Air Force versus Air Force war. Remember those good old days, the good old days of the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War? Because look what we're fighting now. Children and suicide bombers and people coming into cafes and into pizza parlors and children who are being used as human shields. And these are all facts that happen on a regular basis. It gets reported here and there, but it becomes part of the routine way of life to the extent that even Israelis forget about it. So my experiences, or my perspective on this, is really born out of my own experiences. In the 1980s, early 1980s, I served in the Israel Defense Forces for a few years, and I was in what is now called the First Lebanon War. The First Lebanon War in 1982, for which, by the way, there's a film which this morning I understand was nominated for Best Foreign Film in the Academy Awards, a film called Waltz with Bashir, an animated documentary feature made by Israel, by an Israeli producer and director. That war was essentially exactly what's happening now. And the same thing happened then. Because there were many media reports who were shocked at Israel's lopsided, quote-unquote, response. There were many who criticized and critiqued what Israel was doing. Forgetting, of course, that throughout the 1970s, I have friends, personal friends, who grew up in bomb shelters. When they lived in Kiryat Shmona in the north, they grew up under the threat of Katyusha rocket attacks every day of their lives. In 1982, when Israel went in to try to destroy the infrastructure of the PLO, and it succeeded in doing so, at least temporarily, by expelling the PLO from Lebanon. They had built a terror infrastructure within the Lebanese population, and the Lebanese themselves. I remember going into Lebanon as an IDF soldier. The Lebanese showered us with rice, like heroes, to come in and finally remove the reign of terror of the PLO. Hamas, no different, has done exactly the same thing. And people have forgotten that for years, Hamas was elected on the mandate of change and of helping its population. Lots of money has come in to the territories. Lots of money has come to Hamas. And what have they done with it? Very little for their own population, very little for their own people. Their own people are some of the worst victims of their leadership. And as a result, they have spent a lot of their money and time and energy building up an arsenal of rockets and weapons which they've used against civilian populations. And so when Israel went in a few weeks ago, it wasn't so much based on let's launch an offensive. I look at it from, I'm not a lawyer or I've never studied law in this kind of context, but I have studied law in the Talmud. And the Talmud has some very, very interesting concepts about how to defend ourselves. And there is a principle that says in Hebrew, in Talmudic law, Haba lehorgecha hashkem lehorgo. If one seeks to kill you and is threatening your life, then you must do everything you can in self-defense. And of course, we know that the worst victims of that are the civilian populations. That's really the difficult piece of it for every single Israeli soldier, myself included when I was in Lebanon during the 1980s. It was a tremendous moral dilemma to see some of my own friends shot by 10-year-old kids. Now, what do you do when you catch the 10-year-old kid with a Kalashnikov AK-47? Do you take him over your knees and spank him? Do you call his parents and say, we need to have a meeting with you? Do you shoot him and kill him, or you just send him off? These are the moral dilemmas that IDF soldiers face day in and day out, whether it was in Lebanon in the 80s, in Lebanon 2 years ago, or once again in Gaza. And the population, the leadership of Hamas is not sensitive to that. They're not sensitive to their own children. They're not looking to build lives for their own children. They're instead looking to destroy the lives of others. And I think unless that gets reported, then we're going to continue to see a very biased, one-sided view of the conflict. And the ceasefire, as it was so called, was not really even a ceasefire. It was Israel simply unilaterally declaring, we're leaving. There are some who say perhaps they timed it with the inauguration of President Obama. That could be. But rockets continued to land in Israel even after Israeli forces declared a ceasefire and decided to leave. So this is my perspective, coming from not necessarily a legal point of view, except a Talmudic one, but understanding from that a humanitarian point of view. Israel most definitely showed good faith in wanting to solve the problem in Gaza, one final point, by pulling out 8,000 of its civilians who lived in the Gaza Strip for years and years and years, built lives there, and the Israelis pulled them out. Prime Minister Sharon, a few years ago, actually evacuated 8,000 Israeli men, women, and children who lived in the Gaza Strip and said you could no longer legally, that would be an interesting thing to explore from international law as well, legally the government is pulling you out, the military and the police are pulling you out, you could no longer live here. What was the response of Hamas? A missile war on civilian populations. This is what Israel responded to a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Join me again in saying to our special guest, Rabbi Bouskila, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to hear from Professor Cossack momentarily, and yes, that would be great. We're going to now be passing out cards. For those of you familiar with Pepperdine events, we follow the National Press Club example. Namely, if you have a question, and we hope that you will, if you would write it, preferably print it, and then pass it to the aisle. There will be colleagues who will be picking up the cards. You know the drill. Just write your question, hopefully as short and as succinct as you can. And we will hopefully have ample time for Q's and A's. I'm delighted to see that especially our students, this is their 1 hour break, but we also want our guests to feel welcome as well, that people are quietly heading to the food and enjoying the conversation at the same time. We have now been joined, and I'm sorry that our dear friend, Judge Bruce Einhorn, was delayed. Bruce, I said beforehand, Your Honor, very short introductions, but my favorite thing about Bruce, who's had such a distinguished career as a great public lawyer, as a judge here, and now as not only as a professor here at Pepperdine, but also the director of our asylum clinic. We feel strongly about those who've come to the United States and who fear, justifiably, returning to their homeland on a basis of persecution because of their politics, their race, their ethnicity, their religious perspective, and so forth. So, Bruce, thank you for being with us. We'll now hear from Professor Cossack, who will reflect with us on the media coverage.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Rabbi and all for allowing someone named Cossack to be to even sit next to them and everything. I assure you, Rabbi, that what happened was that when Grandfather Cossack got here, he spoke very little English, and when he got to Ellis Island, they looked at him and he says he tried to explain his name. They said, "You're a Cossack," and we had really very little to do with what else. Okay, okay. And Dean, you're right about the Washington Post, but I usually argue with Charles Krauthammer, but I argue with Tom Friedman in the Times too, so that's okay. Many, many years ago, Marshall McLuhan, who was a great commentator, perhaps the first great commentator on the media, said, he said, the media is the message, and the message is the media. And I remember when he said that, and it was a lot younger than I am now, and I thought, what the heck is he talking about? And I really didn't understand, and it took me a while before I got into television and had the opportunity to become part of the media, that I began to understand that how the media becomes, how the message becomes the media becomes the message. I am not here today to say who was right and who was wrong. I am a person who believes that there is no war, that you can make a Charles Krauthammer statement that says there is no moral issue here. War to me is immoral under just about all circumstances. And so I say that understanding that there will be wars and understanding that in situations one side could be righter than the other side, I just find it an immoral thing. So I am not here today to take a side, but to try and explain to you a little bit about how the press works, and a little bit about how reporting happens, and perhaps not to in any way excuse the press if you feel the press's report of what went on in the war was incorrect or one-sided, but merely to try and describe to you the workings of the press. Journalists, newspapers, media look for messages. Each side has its message. Israel had a message that it wanted to get across in this war. What was its message? Its message was, we are the victims. We have, for a number of years, been the victims of rocket attacks on our southern cities. We have begged, we have asked, we have pleaded, we have negotiated, we have offered to negotiate, we have done everything we possibly can. No one would put up with the idea of having its citizens, no government would put up with, and should not put up with, the idea of having its citizens subject to an attack, a rocket attack, on a daily or almost daily basis. We have done everything we can to ask you in a nice way to stop this. You wouldn't do it. So finally, we had to do something about it. That is the Israeli message. So why has that message, in some ways, been lost a little bit in this war? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's journalism. And as the Rabbi well pointed out, what happened is that this has gone on for a long time. And so the immediacy of the message of what has been going on got lost because it went on and went on and went on. And as the rabbi so well points out, that in Israel even, rocket attack tonight, let's go, what are you doing for the movies later? Imagine us in America fully removed. But for a second, think about it. I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and I said, imagine us, I live in Georgetown, and I said, imagine if we lived in Georgetown, and every day or every other day there were rockets and falling around Georgetown around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon before children were home, and the terror, it's a terrorist attack, and imagine the terror that you would feel. If this happened, even if rockets fell in the Mojave Desert, where there was no one for miles and no one was injured, you know how long the United States of America would stand for that. It wouldn't happen the second day. So here is Israel that went on and on and on. So what happened? It went on and it went on and it went on, and journalism and journalists moved on to other things. There's major problems in the world. There's our economy. There's a recession. There's a lot of different things that are going on within the world. And the nature of the beast is that it moves on to something else. Now, what was Hamas's message? Hamas's message was brutality, proportionality, carnage, and civilian suffering. So why was Hamas's message apparently so much successful, so much more successful in making in the newspapers in the last 2 weeks? Well, one reason may be that the Israelis refused to allow the press to go in with their troops. Now, why would they do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One reason was, they said, we cannot guarantee the safety of the press. But the press would say, that's fine. We understand our job. We understand the problems that we have. And maybe there's a reason that the press has to be managed. But I promise you that everything I'm telling you today, the people who run the Israeli government and Hamas, they know as much about the media, if not more, than I do. So the Israelis knew that in some ways, by not letting the press in with them, that they would cede the role of the message to Hamas. That, in fact, the way the journalism works, that Hamas would be able to better control the story because they would be the one that would be taking the pictures. They would be the one. Gee, did I insult anybody? Did somebody flick up against the switch?
No, it's a power failure.
Is it a power failure? Rabbi, did I say something that offended somebody higher up?
My recommendation is that we continue.
Okay. All right. Well, then,
Open the door here.
without notes. Okay. So why was Hamas? So why was Hamas so much? Gee, I've never done this in a dark room. Why was Hamas so much more successful? Because they were the ones that were able to control the message. They were the ones that were able to have their press send out their pictures of what they wanted the world to see. Now, I am convinced that the Israelis took this into consideration before they attacked. I think it's for me, it would be hard to believe that they did not know that Hamas was going to control the message. And they also knew that, in fact, that this war was going to be a war in which there were going to be a great deal of civilian casualties. I think that was all factored in before this war took place. It's impossible to believe that they did not know there were going to be civilian casualties. And while the argument is that there may be more civilian casualties that were necessary because of human shields, because of putting guns next to schools or UN headquarters, and that war is just, sloppy. When they talk about smart bombs, it always makes me laugh because, they're not so smart, these bombs. And so they must have known that this was going to be the result of this. But the question then becomes, was this enough to prevent them, to stop Israel from going in? And obviously the answer is not, it wasn't, and obviously the answer for that is because there was really, number one was, there was no other way to stop these rockets. Another thing I think should be taken into consideration is, as the rabbi points out, Hamas was elected by a popular vote. Whether or not it's responsive to the needs of the public is somewhat open to debate. But nevertheless, one could easily say and conclude that this government has caused a great deal of pain and a great deal of hardship to the people of Gaza. What do they really accomplish by sending rockets into the southern part of Israel? Not very much. It's really, I mean, it's terrible. Occasionally someone loses their life, and I don't mean to demean that, but it really is not the kind of, it doesn't really weaken Israel. In fact, it makes Israel even more resolved and more strong. So why do they do this? They must do this in a way, in a sense of some kind of a feeling that this, they show strength, and therefore the people will, be more in their favor. But in fact, recently there has been some indications that the people of Gaza are not so happy about what happened. And I think that one of the things you can say is that another part of the attack by Israel may have been, and the aggressive part of their war may have been to say to the people of Gaza, if you keep these people involved, if you keep voting in Hamas, this is the kind of, and this is just purely my opinion, this is the kind of action that you will get, whereas if you went and like the other side and had PLO, perhaps you would have peace because you would have people that would negotiate with you. So in a war, it is the current picture that gets reported. It is not, as the rabbi says, sadly, the picture of 5 years ago or 4 years ago or rockets that fell. It is the picture that is today. And in this war, Israel clearly made a decision that they were going to cede the message, I think at least, to Hamas. And I think that that was taken into consideration. If you think about it, they were the ones that were able to control the message, and they were the ones that were able, therefore, to put out the message on a worldwide basis. Now, before I came down here, no dummy me, I got on the internet for a moment, and I said, what is BBC saying? And there was a couple of different stories that I wanted to just show you the headlines to. One was new evidence of Gaza child deaths. And it's a tragic story about this little child who was shot and how sadly her mother and father feels. Her uncle is by her bedside, and there's a doctor of neurosurgery, and it's a terrible story. And so at the end it says, but for the people who lived here, this is a story of wanton destruction. The world must now decide whether the Israeli action here was justified under the rules of war. There was also another story in BBC that said this: Gaza ruins pose question for Hamas. And the story was that Hamas was now running around in this city saying, how, boy, we beat them and we really stuck it to them and they ran out of here and we won. But that the people in this little town just weren't buying this and buying it. And that the BBC reporter went to them and said, who are you? And they said, well, we're all freedom fighters. But when you questioned them, it turned out none of them had really fired a weapon in this war. And as Hamas was trying to rally the crowd for thousands of people to show up, this is the first time they were pointing out that they couldn't get thousands of people to show up. And there were very few green flags that were being unfurled. He said, and so they interviewed one person. He says, I blame Israel, but I blame Hamas too. I just want to live. So, two stories, perhaps not as fair and balanced as we would like it to be, but I hope that at least in a little ways I explained to you at least how journalists work, and perhaps you can understand why the story of this incursion by Israel has been reported the way it has.
again, I'm delighted that people are quietly going back. Sorry about that power failure, but we've got it back, and the conversation continues. We will start gathering up the questions. Would you join me in welcoming a very special friend of Pepperdine, and so many of us here, Judge Bruce Einhorn.
I apologize for my tardiness. Californians tend to get very apocalyptic when it drizzles. But that's a topic for another lecture. Psychiatry and the law. I'm privileged to be here today, and I'm particularly privileged because I've been given an opportunity to speak on issues of importance to me, given the subject matter I teach. And I'm flattered that so many students present and former of mine are here to listen. I'd like to first begin by offering the suggestion that we all try as lawyers to separate debates about policy, which are critical to this issue, and to the larger issue of Israeli-Palestinian relationships, from the questions of law that pertain to the Gaza offensive and to matters related to the Middle East. As I say, the policy questions are as important as the legal questions, but the question of law is the question of whether Israel had the authority under international law to engage in this offensive, and whether Israel acted within the bounds of international law in the manner in which it responded to the Hamas bombardment of Israeli territory. Those are two questions that in international law go to, first, what is called in Latin the jus ad bellum, the questions of when warfare or military actions may be lawfully undertaken. And the second goes to the issue of jus or jus in bello, the questions of what kinds of activities may be initiated in a time of war. So you have the first question of when is a war not desirable, I agree with Professor Cossack, but when is a war lawful, or when is a military action lawful? And the second kind is what kinds of military activities may be undertaken under international law. And let me begin with a quote of some relevance on the question of when warfare or when military actions may be taken. Both the quote and the person who made the quote are relevant. If somebody were sending rockets into my house where my two daughters sleep at night, I would do everything to stop that and would expect Israel to do the same thing. Those quotes, that was a quote from the president, Barack Obama. And it is a quote that in a lay sort of way does encapsulate the position of whether Israel acted lawfully to engage militarily in the Gaza offensive. The first source to which I think we should look is the United Nations Charter. Judge Starr and I always have a habit of carrying around the Constitution of the United States. For those of you who want another illustration of the majesty of this document, this is the Constitution of the United States. This is the Charter of the United Nations, together with just a little commentary. Talk about aggressive war. I think part of the problems we face in discussing international law is that it is a complicated field where a lot of people speak as much from ignorance as from knowledge, and it's a difficult field to master. I haven't mastered it, and I just study it. The UN Charter talks about the right of self-defense, and like many legal documents, it talks about it in a way that's certainly open to discussion. But I think there is a way to plow through it and get to the point of whether Israel's action, as I believe, is justifiable under international law. The policy questions can be discussed separately. Under Article 2, Clause 4 of the UN Charter, the United Nations makes clear that the member states of the organization are bound as a fundamental principle to seek the peaceful resolution of disputes. That is a general principle of law, not just of policy, and it is enshrined at the very beginning of the Charter. And Israel, as a member of the United Nations, is bound to that principle. However, there are 2 points about that principle that should be understood and that I think clearly emerge from the wording of Article 2. First, that it refers to nation states. It does not refer to non-state actors who may engage in aggressive conduct toward nation states or their populations. Secondly, the same provision of Article 2 talks about the obligation to seek the fundamentally peaceful resolution of disputes, but does not specifically prohibit the right of nation states to engage in military action to defend themselves if their first efforts to resolve matters peacefully are unsuccessful. And hence, we have Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which arguably could be considered an exception, or I would argue a specific principle adjacent, if you will, to the general principle of Article 2. Article 51 guarantees the right of individual and collective self-defense in the face of armed attacks, and those rights are guaranteed to nation states, both members of the United Nations and those nations like, say, Switzerland, that are not members of the United Nations, but are members of the nation-state community. And so the question is, under these principles, does Israel have the right to engage in action of a military nature against Hamas in Gaza in response to the attacks by Hamas on Israeli territory? And I would argue yes. For 8 years, Israel has been the subject of military attacks through missile launches aimed at Israeli communities on Israeli soil, not disputed Israeli soil, but what many people would call Israel proper, particularly the town of Sderot. 3/4 of the children of this town, of this city, have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder because of the regularity of the bombardment of this city, which has no military installations except a civilian guard and outlying troops in the area. There are other communities that have been the subject of this 8-year bombardment. The bombardments have been launched by Hamas, an organization which in its charter calls for the destruction of Israel and contains numerous anti-Jewish references that go beyond the political to the ethnic and religious. Hamas is an extremist organization that, in my humble opinion, perverts the beneficent principles of Islam and talks about, in its charter and in its policies, the eradication of Jews and other so-called non-believers from the Holy Land. This is the organization, an organization that almost all major nation states, including the United States, regard as terrorist, as a terrorist group, is responsible for the bombardment of Israel proper. This is an organization that has refused to negotiate with anyone regarding a compromise to create a Palestinian state that doesn't include the whole of Israel. And this is the organization that has been responsible for 8 years of attacks on Israel. Now, for 8 years, Israel did not launch a specific Gaza offensive to take out the missile sites or respond to these attacks. And indeed, during the 8 years, Israeli forces withdrew from Gaza, and I think appropriately forced out of Gaza several Jewish settlements that had been made in the territory. And yet, during this same period, Israel was consistently and regularly attacked by the forces of Hamas. Indeed, Hamas has never made any bones about its actions in this regard. Hamas, according to most international and nation-state sources, has received its arms supplies through the Egyptian border surreptitiously, and has received either weapons or money for these supplies from the government of Iran. Now, under the International Convention for the Fighting of Financial Support for Terrorism, nation states are obliged to stop doing exactly what Iran has been doing. Israel has responded to this after 8 years by an offensive measure against a specific piece of territory not part of the sovereignty of Iran, and thus has engaged in a very limited strike, however violent, without an attempt to violate the principles of Article 2, calling for peaceful resolution of disputes among nation states. Accordingly, over the past 8 years, Israel has received sufficient provocation under the provisions of the United Nations Charter for engaging in the only remedy left to it in the wake of the failure of the United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to engage in collective actions of self-defense, or in lieu of any regional action on the part of Arab states to engage in restraint of Hamas. Indeed, one of the more interesting hallmarks of the Gaza offensive has been the relative silence of Arab states in the face of Israeli incursions. The silence speaks loudly to the acknowledgement, I think, of much of the Arab state community that this action was precipitated by Hamas aggression, which many of these states have not actively opposed, but most of them oppose as a matter of practical policy because of what it has done to the credibility of the Arab position in an effort to compromise over a Middle East peace. And so under the provisions of the UN Charter, it seems that Israel clearly has a right of self-defense which it has exercised. And Israel has satisfied the requirements of Article 51 of the Charter by immediately informing the United Nations Security Council of its initial incursions and subsequent actions in Gaza. Remember that Hamas is not a sovereign entity. At best, it is a political party that won parliamentary elections within Gaza and whose leaders are to report to the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, also known by his real name of Mahmoud Abbas, who lives on the West Bank in the town of Ramallah, and who has been very often physically threatened by Hamas leaders and forces. And so there is no sovereign state entity that can claim under the United Nations Charter or any conventions on terrorism any right to engage in aggressive action against Israel, which violates that jus in bello principle anyway, or any right to rebut the right of Israel to defend itself under Article 51 of the Charter and customary principles of international law. Indeed, even if Hamas were a nation state, its actions would be considered acts of war against Israel, aggressive military actions, however successful, however much as a matter of policy we can debate to how they should have been responded, but actions which would even justify Israeli military action. The second question we must address is the question of proportionality. Whether, once we get past a debate on whether Israeli actions initiating the offensive in Gaza are lawful under international principles, the specific activities of the Israeli military are proportionate and therefore violative or not violative of the customary and treaty-based principles of the laws of war. In other words, whether Israel has committed war crimes. The critics of Israel have claimed that Israeli actions have caused collateral damage, or to use the more plain and appropriate word, civilian casualties. And certainly Israeli actions have caused such casualties. And the argument goes that those casualties are so much larger than the casualties Israel has incurred in these actions, that Israel has essentially committed disproportionate acts of criminality under the laws of war in its undertakings in Gaza. Under international law, however, when one examines principles of proportionality, one does not engage in a mathematical formula. No nation state of a democratic nature, or I would submit of a reasonable nature, would engage in military action in which it anticipates that its casualties would be greater than the casualties of its foe. Every nation state that has engaged in military self-defensive action in this generation, including the United States, which has engaged in what the international community has not disputed is its legal right to fire upon Taliban and al-Qaeda forces at the borderline between Pakistan and Afghanistan, have caused a lot of civilian casualties, as well as a lot of casualties on the part of terrorist organizations. The United States has not been brought to the attention of the Security Council as a war criminal state because its actions cause civilian casualties. In Africa, there has been widespread rape and criminality in the Congo, and the efforts of sovereign governments to alleviate that suffering, and today there has been a recent offensive by Congolese and Rwandan troops against Hutu militias that left Rwanda because they were allegedly responsible for the genocide. Those actions have been undertaken, and while they should be the concern of discussion at the Security Council, there has been no finding that those actions are the actions of war criminals. Why? Because the intention of these military actions is to target those responsible for acts of illegal aggression under international law, and were calibrated in a reasonable way to do so. The civilian casualties that occurred are tragic, and we can debate as a matter of policy whether Israel or the United States in Central Asia or any other country involved in these activities should have done what it did. But as a matter of law, the issue is whether these nations had the right to do as they did, and Israel's actions under the principle of proportionality are, I would submit, legal. They are legal because they were carefully calibrated. They are legal because only when Israel asked Hamas fighters to leave the areas of schools and mosques and other public facilities that are not the subject of armed attack under international law, and only when those Hamas fighters refused to do so, did Israeli forces defend themselves in actions targeting those fighters, which may have resulted in civilian casualties, although there are media reports, most of them buried under initial media reports, not always reported in the BBC, I would say, that Hamas actually brought children into the areas of schools and other public facilities in order to show that Israel was targeting civilians in a way even larger than the casualties that emanated from the actual attacks. This in no way diminishes the tragedy and awfulness of the attacks, and in no way should take away from the policy debate on these issues. But as a matter of law, Israel has attempted, insofar as feasible, to calibrate its attacks, and as a matter of international law, that intention, that motivation, and that initial action disallows the claim of lack of proportionality. And therefore, under international legal norms, Israel's actions constitute not war crimes, but actions which fall within the parameters of lawful conduct of a military action. And that's it.
That's it.
That's it.
Thank you. Very good.